Hey guys, Foxflinger here. The long-awaited next entry in the series is here, and this time we're knocking out Superprops and early jets, every fighter from the 5.7 to 7.0 BR range. That's 63 unique flight models tested, plus this time I was stupid enough to at least try one flap setting for each plane, basically doubling this list. Safe to say this took over 16 hours of just flying around in test flight to gather this data, not to mention the processing and graphing that came after, so hopefully it's worth the effort. Either way, we have a lot to cover, so let's just get right to it. If you're new to the series, don't worry, I'll give a brief rundown of how this will work. If you've been here before or know how EM diagrams work, you can skip this part. So, in this video, we're going to be looking at the flight performance of each tested plane and compare them against a benchmark to see how well they perform against each other in different flight characteristics like sustained turn rate, max climb rate, max level flight speed, things like that. You might be wondering how we're going to compare so many different planes in an objective way. Don't worry, this isn't going to be another subjective tier list. We have actual numbers to back these up. What we're going to be using is an EM diagram, which is basically just a really convenient way to visualize a lot of these different flight characteristics in one neat package. This dot represents our plane, and depending on how it's maneuvering and what it's doing, it'll end up somewhere on this graph. We can see that the graph is plotting turn rate against speed. So if our dot is here, we can read that our plane is currently going 300 kph while turning 20 degrees per second. If our plane then stopped turning while keeping its speed, the dot would move here. So as our plane maneuvers, turning and changing speed, the dot will move around to reflect what it's doing. Now, this dot can't go anywhere on this plot since how fast it can go and how much it can turn is limited by the airframe. We can show these limits by drawing an outline around the region that the plane can maneuver within. So our plane should be able to maneuver with a turn rate and speed within this region, while it shouldn't be able to achieve anything outside of it. Different planes with different flight characteristics have different limits, and we can directly compare them with these graphs. Some planes can turn tighter, some planes go faster, some can do both, and some can do neither. This is a good starting point for our comparison, but this graph would be much more useful if we had a way to measure energy retention. Energy retention is basically how much speed or altitude you lose or gain while maneuvering. If you turn sharply at high speeds, you'll lose a lot of speed since your plane is producing a lot of drag over your thrust. If you fly in a straight line at low speeds, you'll gain a lot of speed since your plane is producing a lot of thrust over drag. If you're sustaining a turn, or you're at max level flight speed, your thrust and drag are equal, so you won't lose or gain any speed. So we've been comparing how much more thrust is produced over drag, but we actually have a name for this value: specific excess power. We can measure what the excess power is at each point and create a contour plot to show its value. On this side of the line we have positive excess power, meaning we produce more thrust than drag, and on this side of the line we have negative excess power, meaning there's more drag than thrust. When you're on the zero excess power line, that means that thrust is equal to drag, so you'll neither gain nor lose speed. This is the point where the maximum amount of excess power is produced, meaning that it's at this speed that our plane will have the best climb rate. This point here, where the zero excess power line meets the x-axis, is the maximum level flight speed, where our plane will neither gain nor lose speed. The highest point on the zero excess power line is the maximum sustained turn rate, meaning this is the best turn we can maintain without losing or gaining speed. Now that we know what to look for on one graph, we can start to compare them. The red plane is the Ki-84 Otsu, and the blue plane is the Spitfire LF Mk IX. This shading is to indicate how much difference there is in specific excess power, with the dark red meaning that the Ki-84 loses a lot less energy than the Spitfire in this region, and the light blue meaning that the Spitfire gains a bit more energy than the Ki-84 in this region. We can see that the Spitfire has a higher climb rate, a higher sustained turn rate, a higher instantaneous turn, and a slightly higher level flight speed. The only advantage that the Ki-84 has is its maximum airframe speed and high-speed energy retention. Safe to say that the Spitfire would win this dogfight without too much thought. So these are the main details to look for in an EM diagram. It doesn't capture all aspects of flight performance, but it's still really useful for judging an aircraft's general characteristics. This is just a SparkNote summary for EM diagrams and specific excess power. If you'd like a more detailed explanation, or you'd like to know how I generated these graphs, then you can take a look at the first 3 videos in this series that I've linked in this playlist. Now that we're all on the same page, there are a few things to note before we jump in. First, flaps and their performance impact. Flaps do 3 main things. First, they lower stall speed. Second, they increase lift, letting you turn more for a given speed. And third, they increase drag. So flaps are useful when you're willing to increase drag for a temporary bit of extra lift and turn. situations like a one-circle fight and scissors. They're also useful at the top of vertical loops since you're probably already going pretty slow, so the extra drag doesn't slow you down too much. In a two-circle fight or a raid fight, it's a little trickier. For most planes, using flaps is not a good idea since while the flaps might make your turn radius temporarily tighter, the extra drag they produce will make your sustained turn rate worse. There are a few planes that do benefit from using flaps, usually by tightening their radius without too much loss in turn rate, but some planes even get a boost in turn rate when using flaps. Because this very much depends on the plane, I'll be bringing it up whenever it's relevant, but if I don't mention it, then you can safely assume that the flaps reduce rate as they would on most planes. Second, the same conditions and disclaimers apply as the previous videos. If there are specific changes I've applied for certain tests, I'll bring them up when relevant. As a reminder, all of this is experimentally gathered data, and because the data itself is quite messy, the results aren't 100% accurate, so keep that in mind. Third, since all these tests were done at low altitude, I sometimes provide qualitative context on how well an aircraft's engine performs at high altitude. I'm going to be doing this using War Thunder Aircraft Performance Calculator, a website where you can go and compare piston engine power performance in relation to altitude. Definitely check it out on your own as well, it's a very useful website. Next, this was a very big project, so there are likely mistakes or inaccuracies. I've done my best to proofread this multiple times, but it's very possible that a number of things slipped through. I'm also not familiar with historical aircraft performance, and I also haven't played some of these planes, so I might say something stupid. So when I do, I'd greatly appreciate if you correct me in the comments. And finally, if you don't want to hear me yap about these graphs and you just want to look at them yourself, they're all uploaded to my Google Drive as usual, so you can just go view them there. Now we can finally get started. I'd highly recommend that you skip to the planes that you're most interested in checking out. Don't just sit through this whole thing, it's going to be very long. I'll have timestamps in the description so you can navigate to wherever you want. To absolutely no one's surprise, the P-51H is very strong. Great climb, great level flight speed, and a very good rate, especially for an American plane. On paper, the FR-U-4B looks kinda meh. Doesn't turn or climb the best, but it still goes very fast. Still a significant upgrade over the FR-U-4 at 4.3 thanks to the much stronger engine. However, if we take a look at the flaps, we can see that they're very effective at tightening the turn without sacrificing rate, making it great for stall shots and overshoots. This is a trait on all of the Corsairs. The Bearcat is near identical to the 4.7 one, but this one's slightly heavier, making the higher BR one slightly worse in flight performance. Still very strong purely from its climb rate and top speed, but the flight performance overall, it is worse than the P-51H in basically every regard. The F7F is kind of meh, especially for a 6.3. It can go fast and climbs pretty well, but as we'll see, it's probably the least competitive heavy interceptor BR for BR. The combat and takeoff flaps do help a bit. The 84 is pretty decent. It won't win against a dedicated dogfighter, but if the enemy makes a mistake, then you'll stand a chance against some of the less turny planes. The air brake is also nice for overshoots. The AM1 is not quite as good as the AD4, but it is at a lower BR. The P-47M is actually pretty much the same as the D-28 or the D-30 when at the deck, where they're all pretty bad. In particular, their level of flight speed is very low for an American plane. Granted, the P-47s are built for high-altitude engine performance, but even still, the M is only better than the D-28 or D-30 once you go past 6,000 meters altitude. So for the most part, it's just better to play the D-28 or D-30 at a much better BR. The P-59 is our first jet on this list, and it's a really weird one. You can go decently fast, it turns very hard and very tight, and its sustained turn rate is surprisingly high. Its obvious weakness is that it climbs and accelerates pretty poorly, so you'll usually be fighting on the defensive, but it has basically all the tools to do so. It's not quite as fast as I thought it would be. 660 kph is slower than the P-51H on the deck. The AU-1 is basically the FR-U-4B, but heavier and with a worse engine. Plus the fact that it's usually played as a bomb truck means that it's not that great. Its one advantage is that it gets a strike aircraft air spawn though. The A1H is halfway between the AM1 and the AD4, though in most cases you're probably going to be carrying gun pods, so it's probably worse. The F2G is very strong at low altitudes thanks to its monster engine. It also has the base flight model of the early Corsairs, meaning that it has a better instantaneous turn. Compared to the FR-U-4B, it also climbs much better. These benefits do come at a cost, since the F2G is at a higher BR, it has worse guns, and it has worse engine power above 4 kilometers altitude. The F-80 is one of the more maneuverable jets with a respectable sustained turn, a solid first jet pick. The F-84 really only does one thing well, and that's going fast. the slower you go, the worse you turn, so with its terrible energy retention, it's probably a good idea to not dogfight anything unless you absolutely have to. The F3D is very meh. Basically, it does everything worse than the F80 apart from the air spawn and the guns. The F89 is surprisingly strong. While it doesn't turn all that particularly well, the engines are very powerful enough to cause wing ripping at full throttle on the deck. This gives it a very strong climb, and it's basically an F84B, but better in most regards apart from the high speed performance. The A2D is probably the most powerful prop with an insane top speed and climb rate. Baseline, its turn rate isn't that impressive, but the flaps are very good, both tightening turn radius and increasing rate. Thankfully it's at 7.0, so for most of the time it can't bully other props the same way the Wyvern does. The BF109K4 is pretty meh for its BR. The lower BR BF109s had exceptional low-speed stall performance, and while the K4 is also good in this department, a lot of other planes in other nations are just as good now, if not better. The flaps help with tightening the turn, but they're really annoying to use because they take 10 years to deploy. The Ta-152H1's strong suit is energy retention. Out of the box, it looks kind of mid, but its strength comes from when you deploy its flaps. It's one of the rare planes that gains turn rate when you use flaps, and with its tighter radius, it's a very solid dogfighter. Try to deploy your flaps anytime you're doing any sort of turning maneuver, since you're basically throwing if you're not constantly using flaps while in a dogfight. The Ta-152C3 flies more like a heavy interceptor like the F7F than any typical fighter. The flaps are useful, but it's more of a boom and zoomer than a dedicated dogfighter. For a boom and zoomer though, it doesn't really go that fast or climb that well, so it's kind of reliant on its air spawn to start a fight with an energy advantage. Otherwise, it's not that great, probably only at this high BR thanks to the Mk103. The 262 is okay, but compared to the F80, it is just straight up worse. The Jabo and the A1A U4 can be fun thanks to the air spawn, but the base A1A is really not worth using. The HE162 is the fastest plane at its BR by a margin of around 200 kph, so it's actually more comparable to the 262 or the F80 than any plane at its BR. A surprisingly good climb rate too, could be useful for energy traps. On paper, the Ho229 is surprisingly strong. What's interesting is that the maximum rate speed occurs not at the instructor limit, but at 400 kph here in the middle, so you could feasibly outrate even some props. It'll still be annoying to use thanks to the lack of rudder and poor engine power, but I might have to take another crack at trying this plane out. The Mk.III is pure energy. Everything on this graph being deep blue should be enough proof that this thing is an incredibly strong energy fighter and general dogfighter. The actual turn radius isn't that tight, but because the engine is so powerful, its turn rate is incredible. This does come with some downsides of below average firepower, worse high altitude engine power, and a very hard airframe speed limit. The Mk.IX UT is a bit more well-rounded, comparable to the 109K4, not that much to write home about. The LA9 is incredibly similar to the Bearcat. Strong engine, very fast, poor energy retention, even its high altitude engine performance, almost to the point where it seems like a clone. Decent flaps too. The VK107 is not quite as strong as the Mk.III on the deck, but once you get to 1.5 kilometers in altitude, they basically perform the same. The Yak 15 is quite strong with a surprisingly good rate, its only downside being the poor acceleration in the airframe limit. The Su-9 is just an Me-262, but slightly worse. I guess it gets an air brake, but it climbs worse, doesn't get an air spawn, and I like the guns less. The Albatross is pretty meh, it's a jet at 6.7, but it's also just worse than the HE162. The BI was tested at max fuel load, and surprisingly it doesn't turn quite as tight as I expected, but that doesn't really matter when the climb rate is more than triple your competition. Not much to say other than how stupid it is even compared to the 7.0 jets. The Tempest Mk V is kind of similar to the F4U4B. It climbs a bit better at low altitude and has sharper instantaneous turn, but gets worse and worse in engine power the higher the altitude. The flaps could have been useful, but they auto-retract when you go above 300 kph, so not as useful as on the Corsairs. I'd probably take a Corsair 9 times out of 10 over the Tempest. The Tempest Mk II is the same thing, but with a wider turn and a stronger engine, but even with the better engine, I would still prefer the Corsair. And now, for the first of 8 different Spitfire variants, the Griffin Mark XIV. For a Spitfire, it's pretty average with an okay turn, climb, and speed. One thing to note for all of the Spitfires is that even the rip speed of the flaps on these Spitfires is really low at around 230 kph for Merlins and 260 kph for the Griffins. They're actually quite good when you can use them. They tighten the turn radius quite a bit without that much sacrifice in rate. Next up, the Griffin Mark 18. Not sure what they changed with this version, it seems basically identical to the Mark 14. The LF Mk IX is a different beast entirely. Compared to the Mark 14, it just does everything better. It's not really that fair. It doesn't quite have the energy retention of the Yak-3U, but it doesn't need it since it turns much tighter and rates so much better. I could see this going up to BR 6.0 or 6.3. The Mark 22 is just another day, another Griffin. It's actually noticeably worse than the Mark 14 because it's just the same plane but heavier. It's probably only at this BR because of the extra firepower it gets. The Mark 24 is exactly the same plane as the 22 but with higher octane fuel, at least in game. So it goes marginally faster and rates marginally better, but it's still worse than the Mark 14. The Seafire 47 is a pretty depressing plane. It turns worse than the Corsair without any of its benefits. Navalizing the Spitfire by slapping so much extra weight on it really made it lose everything good about it. The Sea Fury is a Tempest Mk II that got the same navalizing treatment as the Seafire. Another plane that I look at and just wonder why it's at the same BR as that 4U4B. The Hornet is a very strong plane. Basically it does everything better than the F7F at a lower BR. With a climb rate better than most typical props, I don't think it needs the air spawn, but with it you can basically guarantee an energy advantage every single time. The flaps are also quite good, marginally increasing rate, but they are limited by their rip speed. I tested the Strikemaster with gun pods and it's actually surprisingly good. I think the instructor limit line might be a bit inaccurate as the Strikemaster has the tendency to pull a little bit of extra when you first start a turn, but even with a turn rate of 24 degrees per second would be very impressive. Not quite as turny as the P59 and not quite as fast as the HE162, but a good middle ground. Fast enough to outrun props while rating well enough to dogfight a lot of them if you keep your speed up. This is of course assuming everybody is on the deck with you. A fast prop could probably catch you in a dive. The attacker is pretty on par with the F80, turning worse but having a stronger engine and a higher max level flight speed. What's also interesting is that the wing rip speed is lower than the flap rip speed, so you can deploy any level of flaps at any speed. This is because the flaps also double as air brakes. Unfortunately, they're not quite excellent enough to increase your rate, but you can still use them to tighten your turn circle as you normally would any other plane. The J5N1 is probably the worst performing twin-engine fighter that I'm covering on this list, but it's more understandable since it's at 5.7. It has a low maximum level flight speed, turn only slightly better than the F7F, so it's not the most amazing dogfighter, but its flaps are actually quite good, slightly increasing rate, so it's probably not that bad to use. The N1K2J is very meh, it just seems like a Ki-84 but worse. It actually turns worse than the N1K1 at 5.3, though it does go a bit faster. I've heard people say that the Fowler flaps on it work really well, but as far as I can tell, they're not that interesting. Like, they're not terrible, they're above average, since at least the combat flaps are able to maintain rate, but they weren't quite as exceptional as I was led to believe, especially when you compare them to the performance boost you get when using flaps on the Ta 152H. Top of that, they auto-retract above 330 kph, so you can't even turn them on and off above rip speed like you can on the Spitfires. The N1K2 jaw must be identical, the diagrams are almost exactly the same. If I had known about this, I would not have tested this. I know it gets a few more loadouts, but we really did not need two of these. The Ki-84 Otsu has the same flight performance as the other Ki-84s, and we've been using them as a benchmark. Pretty average, middle-of-the-line plane. The flaps are solid, and unlike the N1Ks, they don't auto-retract, so you can get a bit more use out of them at higher speeds. The J7W is kind of interesting. Basically, it does everything worse than a Bearcat, and is somewhat more comparable to the P47 when on the deck. Also similar to the P47, it maintains its engine power up to high altitudes, so I suppose it fills a similar niche. Its flaps are absolutely useless though, so it's not quite as good as a P47. I guess the guns and the Japanese teams are why it's at a higher BR. The J2M3 is a pretty over-tiered plane at this point. It's slower, turns worse, and climbs worse than the J2M2 at 5.0, so once again it comes down to the guns, which I'd like to say are not worth the BR hike. Flaps are okay though, and worth using, as the combat flaps don't reduce rate. The J2M5 is worse again, only slightly faster while sacrificing everything else. I think at least this one has an engine that performs slightly better once it goes above 500 kilometers altitude, but it's still not worth it. The Mk.83 is the closest competitor to the Hornet. It's slower and climbs worse, but it turns better, a simple trade-off. I think it also loses less engine power at high altitude. Once again, the Japanese flaps on this plane are good, especially since this time you get to use them up to speeds of 520 kph. The Mk.94 II is not that great. It's closer to a heavy interceptor than the other Japanese single engines, and it's quite similar to the J7W, with relatively minimal engine performance loss at even very high altitudes. Unfortunately, it doesn't get an air spawn, and its climb rate is even worse than the J7W, so that plus its rather poor dogfighting performance, it really can't do that much. Flaps are still good though. The J6K1 is a much better fighter, quite comparable to the Mk.84, except with much more firepower. Flaps would also be good if they didn't auto-retract. The Mk.87 is again similar to the J7W and the Mk.94. As far as I can tell, it's just the Mk.94 but somewhat better, but I'd still take the J7W over both of these. The Kikka is surprisingly powerful. I thought it was just the 262 that turned worse, but it's got some real beefy engines to be able to achieve that kind of climb rate. Probably also would be useful for energy traps and vertical fighting against jets, and maybe even some props. Flaps are also good, which is a surprise considering most other jets lose quite a bit of rate when using flaps. The RE2005 is an over-tiered Spitfire. It rates about as well as the Mk XIV with a worse top speed and climb. It's fun because it's maneuverable and it's got good flaps, but it's probably better to just play the Spitfires. The G56 is quite close to the Mk.84 except it climbs worse. Considering it's 6'3", I think this one is probably also over-tiered. The F4U7 has the same engine as the F4U4B but is slightly heavier, so it's actually slightly worse. Not as worse as the AU1, but it's still noticeable on the graph, and it's a little weird that this one specifically is at 6.0, probably because of its ground ordnance. The Spitfire FR Mk XIV is basically identical to the Mk XIV, except now its wingtips are clipped. I expected this would be a trade-off, losing a little bit of turn for a little bit more speed, but if you actually look at the graphs, you lose a lot of turn and quite a bit of climb, and the speed gain is basically none, so it's definitely not worth it, especially if you remember the LF Mk IX is also at the same BR. The S.O.2000 Narval is pretty bad, basically a J7W that turns and climbs worse. It does get an interceptor spawn, and the flaps are usable though. The J21RA is what you'd expect if you put a jet engine on the J21 airframe. The closest comparison is the Yak-15s, which are much better dogfighters thanks to their airframe actually being good. The A21RB is significantly better than the J21RA since it has a much stronger engine. You actually rip in a straight line if you're not careful. The SK60 was tested with gun pods, but even without, it would probably be pretty terrible. I mean, honestly, it's comparable to the F7F, so maybe this is the jet that the F7 eats for breakfast. I'd have to guess it's 7.0 due to the air-to-ground guided missiles. And finally, what better way to end this list than another Spitfire? This time it's the LF Mk IX that got its wingtips clipped, and again the trade-off is really not worth it. It's not quite as bad as the Mk XIV clipped wing since at least the base LF Mk IX is incredibly strong, but there really is no reason to play this if you have the LF Mk IX. If you compare with the non-clipped wing Mk XIV, it's actually quite comparable. Honestly, the LF Mk IX is under-tiered and it should probably be at least 6.0. The clipped wing can stay at 5.7 with the Mk XIV and 18. Now let's see who the winners are in each category. The best sustained turn rate goes to the BI, followed by the LF Mk IX, the Strikemaster, and the Yak-III, then a bunch of planes. While the worst are the F-84, then the Narval, and then a bunch of planes. The best instantaneous turn is the Ho229, followed by the P-59A, Yak-15, RE2005, and LF Mk IX, while the Talon 52C3 and the Narval are tied for worst, followed by the 3 Cannon Corsairs and the Kikka tied for second. The best climb rate goes to the BI, followed by the F-89B, Kikka, A2D, and Attacker. If we look only at props, the best climbers are the Yak-III, followed by the Hornet, LF Mk IX, and Mk.83, and then the clipped wing LF Mk IX. The worst climbers are the Narval, the AM-1, 84, Mk.94, and the A-1H. The best maximum level flight speed goes to the Su-9, followed by the BI, F-89B, and F-84B in second, while the Attacker is in third. If we look just as piston props, we get the Hornet P51H and the Tempest Mk II tied for first, then the Bearcat and the F4U4B in second, and then the LA9, F7F, F2G, F4U7, and AU1 in third. The slowest planes are the RE2005, the J2Ms, the AM1, the N1K2s, and the Key94. If we have to choose one winner, I'd probably say BR for BR, the best Superprop is the LF Mk.IX. Or if we're not considering BR, then I'd say the P51H, just for being able to do everything so well. The worst prop seems to be the Key94, though I haven't played it, so I can't really say that with confidence. Of the ones I have played, I would say the F7F, the Taun 52C3, and the Seafire 47 were the least fun to play. And we're done! If you sat through all of that, congratulations, you're almost as insane as I am. If you watched that and for some reason you need even more EM diagrams specifically for props between 2.7 to 5.3, or you're interested in the process I used to generate these graphs, then they're all in the playlist I've linked, so have fun with that. If you couldn't already tell, this was a very big effort that I spent 6 full days working on, not to mention the 5 months I previously spent writing the code to set this up. And as I've said before, I don't want to paywall any of this stuff, so everything is up on the Google Drive for you to check out for yourself. I probably won't be making any more EM diagrams past the ones I've made so far unless you guys have something specific you'd like me to test. It's not because I don't want to. I can't say I completely enjoyed the process of making these, but they take a lot of effort, and there aren't really any more planes that I really care to test. I'm not that interested in props below 2.3, and for jets you can just go use StatShark. You might actually be wondering why I bothered to test jets at all, considering they're already all up on StatShark anyways. There would have been some issues if I had used StatShark. Firstly, StatShark is not that good at showing the instructor and compression limits for ARB. This is especially apparent when you look at the BI, which we know for a fact compresses like crazy at high speeds. Second, I've been using the same method to generate these graphs, so I didn't want there to be any inconsistencies in the methodology. My method is obviously much less precise and accurate than StatShark, but the data should at least be internally consistent, which is what's important when we're making relative comparisons. Otherwise, StatShark is a fine tool for comparing jet performance. I do wish they made it open source, since I feel like they're overlooking a lot of ways they could use their decompiling of War Thunder's physics engine to show interesting data. But the devs seem pretty cagey about how they managed to crack the physics engine, so not much we can do there. All I know is that if it were open source, there would be like 3 additional features that I would be trying to implement right now. Anyways, I'm just gonna keep chugging along. Even if I'm not making any more EM diagrams, I feel like there's a lot we can do with the data that we have right here. I think it could be interesting to compare every variant of a flight model like the Corsairs or the P51s. I'm also planning on redoing the video on optimizing climb rates, since there's a lot more to say about that specific topic that I can actually gather more data for. But that's all for now. Bye bye.